Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our lessons on U.S. history. This is our third lesson in the series of growing American business and industry, and today's lesson is titled The Rise of Big Business. So let's see how that happens. Well, as businesses grow because of the expansion of industry and the connection of natural resources to the cities where the factories are located, new ways of doing business itself were created. Before the 1880s, businesses were owned by individuals or small groups. Okay, so you would actually have a business owner or a small group of business owners. But increasingly, starting in the 1880s, companies began to seek investors and became corporations. Corporations are owned by a large group of investors. We're not talking about 10. We're not even talking about 20. We're talking about, in some cases, hundreds or thousands of investors. Now, how does this work? How do you get to be a part of a company with 1,000 investors? Well, it's through issuing stock. A corporation's big advantage here is that they can raise money quickly by selling stock. Stock is just a small share of ownership of a company. And you can own a tremendous amount of stock and therefore own a lot of a company, or you can own a single share in just a teeny tiny piece of that company. But it allowed anybody to be a business owner. And when you buy that stock, you give the money for that stock, that ownership, over to the company, and then the company can use that to invest in itself and to expand. And if a corporation is performing well, and if the value of that stock increases, investors who bought that stock early can make lots and lots and lots and lots of money. Now, why do we do this? Well, we do this because stock ownership is less risky than owning an entire business. Also, corporations continue to exist even after its founder dies. Think about like Ford Motor Company. When Henry Ford died, the man who started this company, the company didn't cease to exist. It was a corporation by then with many owners. It continued to go. And for this reason, banks are more likely to loan them money. If they know that you have thousands of owners instead of one, then that company is going to keep going. It's not dependent on a single individual. Where Ford Motor Company, if it was just owned by Henry Ford and no one else, it would have been more difficult to get a loan because the banks might see that as riskier. Also, investors don't have to pay corporate debts if that corporation fails. So if Ford Motor Company owes $1 billion and they go bankrupt, they go out of business, the stock that I have in them becomes worthless, but it doesn't go into negative. I don't owe their debt just because I owned their stock. That debt will disappear. So it's less risky for investors. People love to go into the stock market for this reason. Now, during the late 1800s, we saw this expansion of business. We saw certain corporations doing extremely well, particularly in the oil and steel industries. Because we were making so much and expanding so quickly, oil and steel were essential for that. Oil for the energy needs and steel for the construction needs. And both of these, as they expand, contribute tremendously to the booming American economy. But it also contributed to this growing gap between the super rich and the poor in America. And it starts to get a little out of control during this time. We start to have some extremely, extremely rich people. We're going to talk about a couple of them. First guy is this one right here. John D Rockefeller, the richest guy in the history of the United States. He owned Standard Oil. Standard Oil Company was John Rockefeller's company. And he dominated the American oil industry by creating a monopoly. A monopoly is where just one company controls an entire industry. He owned almost all the oil. And if anybody tried to start up an oil company, he would drop his prices so low that he was actually losing money. But the other company was losing money too. And they would go out of business first because he was so big, he could lose money for a little while. And he did this practice to drive everybody else out And as soon as all those competitors were gone, he raised the prices as high as he possibly could. This is called Rockefeller's Trust. This is a collection of companies all owned by Rockefeller. Owned most of the oil companies in the United States. He was the oil man. And without competition, he set prices very high, particularly on individual people. Now, Andrew Carnegie is another one of these super rich guys. He does it in a slightly different way. Andrew Carnegie is a steel guy, but he purchases all the businesses needed to produce steel. So he wanted to control all aspects of it. So he bought mines, he bought railroads to move the iron ore, he bought mills to turn that iron into steel, and he got rid of all of his competition by being able to drop his prices through streamlining these operations. And both Carnegie and Rockefeller then used a lot of their money for good purposes. This is why we kind of have this mixed history with them. Yeah, they drove prices up on everybody else. Yes, they created monopolies, drove other businesses out, but then they spent their money in a lot of helpful ways. They donated a lot of their money to charities and to universities. This is why we have a lot of things named after these guys now, because they gave a lot of money in a lot of nice ways. But what this all did is it kind of masked society's problems, and it created something that we have called the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, gilding is this thin layer of metal, usually gold or silver, and you put it over something else to make it look shiny. So you could put a thin layer of gold over, say, a wood chair and make it look like a gold chair. By all appearances, this chair looks gold, but it's just gilded. It's got this thin layer on top. That was the American super rich. They were this thin layer. And you'd look at the American economy and you think, wow, that thing's golden. And you realize it was just gilded. It had this thin, very visible layer. Most Americans did not thrive during this time. During the late 1800s, while a few people grew super rich, they had these impressive rags to riches stories, starting out poor, having a great idea, the American dream, yay, I'm super rich. Yeah, but that was so uncommon. And that's how it got this name, the Gilded Age, because the wealth of the few was hiding the fact that that was wood underneath the gold. And not only was it a wood chair, not a golden chair, but that wood was rotting. We had some serious problems. And we were disguising that throughout the late 1800s. And that's going to come back to bite us. But it did inspire a great period of American art, especially literature during the Gilded Age. We had some wonderful writers who came out and tried to expose what was going on. Horatio Alger, Charles Warner, Mark Twain. They write stories that talked about what was going on under the gilding. They would talk about this polish on society and how it really just hid some real serious problems, political corruption, poverty, a lot of problems in America. So we get some great stories out of this time that were more true to what was going on in society. And one of the areas we can look at is to look at the American South. This really showed that, in the South there wasn't even gilding, it seemed like. It was extreme problems with poverty. Reconstruction had failed. The 1870s Reconstruction was done. Poverty was pervasive throughout the South. The war had devastated them, and it will take them a generation or two to recover from this. The booms in business were not booms to Southern business. They were booms to Northern and Midwestern factories. Southerners remained agricultural. Southerners remained on farms in a society that was increasingly not rewarding farming. Most Southerners lived in a system of sharecropping, where the farmers were so poor that they couldn't even pay rent for the land that they lived on. They rented the land, they didn't own it. And they couldn't even pay money to rent it. They had to give away a share of the crops that they were raising. In most cases, most of the crops. And then try to sell what was left. It was a horrible system. It was a system designed to keep sharecroppers in poverty and to benefit a few wealthy landlords. And it was how the American South went. It was how the Gilded Age went. So this is the era of big business. Corporations growing, stock being issued, a few people being extremely successful, but manipulating that success to keep others down. And this Gilded Age, a few wealthy people hiding the poverty of most. I hope you learned something today, and I will see you next time. Farewell.